In the early 1980s, outside a small rural village in northern France, archaeologists on a routine dig unearthed a spectacular and macabre discovery. Thousands of human bones. Experts believe they were the remains of hundreds of Celtic warriors, slain in battle, and buried together with their weapons in some sort of ritualistic display. But most shocking of all was the realization that these men were all headless. It was apparently the scene of a mass decapitation.
We're not just looking at a scene of barbarism and big piles of bodies left after a battle. There's something else going on.
Clearly, this monument is tremendously important to a large community over a long period of time.
We're looking at something which is designed to make a big statement. It's right on the top of the hill. It dominates the landscape.
English archaeologist Martin Brown is intrigued by this mystery. He's traveled to France to discover what is behind this extraordinary collection of bones. Who were these ancient people? Why had they been decapitated? And why had their headless bodies been arranged together in such a bizarre fashion? Martin Brown is in the province of Picardy in northern France to uncover the story behind an amazing Celtic burial site. Just outside the small village of Remnants, an archaeological excavation yielded the largest collection of Celtic bones and weapons ever found in Europe. The shocking nature of these remains tells a bloody story of great battles won and lost.
We originally visited this part of northern France because its connections with the Battle of the Somme, which was fought within a few miles of here. But while I was here, I discovered that there was this amazing pre-Roman site on this hilltop. Very, very strange things going on. Piles of human bone, bodies that had been dismembered, and apparently the systematic removal of all the heads. Now, as an archaeologist, you stop looking at what you came for and you veer off onto what's going on over here. That's what I want to find out.
The site was discovered in 1963 by local archaeologist and aerial photographer Roger Agache. While flying over a hill near Remont, he noticed telltale traces of an ancient building buried beneath the earth, which he photographed. Initial digs revealed a Gallo-Roman complex of buildings. Subsequent deeper digs uncovered an older Celtic site. It appeared to be a large tomb filled with thousands of human bones. Work on the site is continuing, led by French archaeologist Jean-Louis Bernot.
Over the last 20 years, we've been continually excavating, and we have found some quite exceptional things relating to the way in which the dead were treated, particularly after battles.
The most extraordinary thing, perhaps, is the marked absence of human skulls at the site. At some point, either before or after death, these hundreds of bodies had been decapitated. Who were the people carrying out this seemingly barbaric practice? Why did they do it?
The weapons we found and also the several dozen gold coins we found enabled us to calculate quite accurately when the site was built. This site was founded between 280 and 260 BC at the beginning of the 3rd century. And this was a very interesting period for us because these were very troubled times in the ancient world.
The site was dated to the 3rd century. This and its location indicates that it was built by the Celts of Central Europe. Those Celts in what is today France were known as the Gauls. The Celts were described as savage, warlike peoples by classical historians, such as Pausanias, who said,
"On they marched against their enemies, with unreasoning fury and brutish passion. Slashed with axe or swords, they retained their desperation while they still breathed. Pierced by arrow or javelin, their passion did not abate as long as life remained."
Were the classical writers right? Were the Celts bloodthirsty savages who relished warfare? Was the site at Remont a sanctuary, a tomb for the war dead? These peaceful green fields surrounding the hill where the sanctuary is located may once have been the site of a huge, ferocious Celtic battle. They also bear the scars of a more recent conflict. The Battle of the Somme in the First World War was fought across this same part of northern France. Many people come here from all over the world to pay their last respects to the men who fell during the Great War of 1914-1918 and are buried in one of the vast cemeteries in northern France and Belgium. The sight of so many graves is a somber and tragic one for anyone who visits.
One thing that interests me up here is the way that it wasn't the archaeologists who were the first ones to do the excavations on this sanctuary site. Back in the First World War, this whole hilltop was defended by systems of British trenches. They were dug by blokes like my grandfather who was over here just down the road. When they were digging the trench that I'm effectively standing in now, they cut through the bones here. You can see here, that's the edge of the trench, and that's where British entrenching tools have cut through the bones of these 2,000-year-old Celtic warriors.
This area of northern France may have witnessed warfare over many centuries, but it has also enjoyed successes and achievements. Many of its pretty towns and villages have a long and vibrant history, reflected in their fine architecture. Amiens, once the capital of Picardy, boasts a magnificent cathedral, Notre Dame. It is the largest in France, built during the 13th century, and noted for its impressive Gothic arches and curious stone figures. But in contrast to the wonder of monuments such as these in Amiens is the surrounding countryside that is steeped in the blood of fallen warriors. A significant number of these warriors were buried at Riedmont. Many of their bones were unturned by latter-day soldiers when they dug trenches during World War I. But it wasn't until 1982 that the first human bone was scientifically excavated by archaeologists. Since then, the excavation team has uncovered a further 50,000 human bones and thousands of pieces of iron weaponry. Martin's first port of call is the research center in Riedmont village, where many of the objects from the site are being studied. This farm has been converted into laboratories and a small museum, which now houses the bones and artifacts collected from the site. Martin visits researcher Marie Pouillet, who has been studying the weaponry that was found amongst the bones.
We mainly have weapons. We have a whole range of warrior equipment here, plus all the horses' equipment and the equipment for the chariots. The main tool they used was a spear, the most important weapon. So this is a spearhead, which would be fixed to the shaft with a nail. And then we have the shield. And this is a shield groove and what we call a hand guard, which protected the warrior's hand from the other side. And this is another good example of the craftsmanship.
Very, very nice decorative work on there.
And here we have a sign of a fight.
These are where it's been struck?
Yes, most probably with a club, a wooden bludgeon, because the marks are curved.
These crush marks here where it's been... Yeah, and then this of course is the top of the scabbard for the sword.
You would put the sword in here and take it out. And it's interesting because it has this decoration in it here, which would have carried on down there.
The warrior carried a sword slung from a waist belt on the right side, as well as a spear. These weapons must have been used in the battle at Riedmont, the instruments of death for thousands of Celtic warriors. They may also have been used to decapitate the bodies. Can forensics shed more light? Anthropologist Sandrine Thiol is examining the remains to establish whether or not this is indeed a collection of warriors.
What we did was to take 5 measurements across the pelvis, and this was done on bones found at Riedmont, and each time we found that we were dealing exclusively with men.
By studying the tibia, the lower leg bone, it is possible to assess the age of the deceased. An adult tibia is a single piece of fused bone, whereas a juvenile tibia has not yet fully fused together. However, the presence of unfused tibia amongst these bones does not necessarily rule out the possibility these individuals were all warriors.
You have to remember that in earlier populations, you could have adult status in society, yet not still be biologically mature. So at 15, you could be a war chief, even though your bones were not yet completely set.
The clearest sign that these were warriors were the injuries on some of the bones.
Here we have a left humerus with quite a large chunk cut out of it. This implies that the wound was made by a spearhead. Here again, the bone has a small dent in it, a diamond-shaped dent, and could quite well correspond with the impact of a spearhead. Here too, there are signs of spear injury, which could have been inflicted with the intention of making the enemy fall to the ground, so that he could then be killed. So these are all signs of injuries sustained in combat, and in no case is there any sign of the bone starting to heal, which means that the person died instantaneously.
However, these injuries on their own would not have proved fatal. Most fatal wounds from hand-to-hand combat are found on the cranium and the ribs. The absence of skulls and the poor condition of the ribs has meant that very few fatal injuries have been confirmed.
But one case of fatal injury we did find is to this left collarbone. In this area here, we have the subclavicle artery, which if severed would mean instant death. Another sign of injury, which was to the 10th vertebrae. The blade of the sword probably penetrated the organs and severed the aorta. This would be another example of instantaneous death during fighting.
What about the decapitation of the bodies? Was this the cause of death? Or did this mutilation occur after death?
We were able to make a study of all the small bones on the cervical vertebrae, and in each case we could see that repeated blows had been sustained by several of the vertebrae. This would imply that the person was already dead, because I would say that it would be impossible to do this to someone who was alive. And this cut was made at the second vertebrae, or what we call the axis. All the axes we found showed signs of having been cut. And this provides us with an additional clue that this was in fact very careful work. It wasn't decapitation, but the removal of a head.
So the heads were not decapitated with a powerful sword blow, but rather a series of careful and precise cuts, like a skilled butcher carving the meat off a bone. But why such care and precision?
There are a number of muscles around the neck which keep the head in an upright position, and these muscles form a kind of wall around the lower cervical vertebrae. It is very, very difficult to cut here, which explains all these small cuts, because quite a lot had to be cut through before you reached the bone and could cut off the head. So they always cut at the level of the second cervical vertebra. So if they wanted to eviscerate the head, or if they wanted to put the head on the stake, this made it easier to do so.
The traces of brutal combat on the bones are accompanied by signs of the precise surgical removal of heads. But why take the heads? Was this pure savagery or something more significant?
Well, these extraordinary remains really require some sort of explanation. So one of the things that I did was to go back to classical authors, people like Julius Caesar. Now they give us a picture of savage, barbaric, warlike Celts who are living here in northern France. And you know, when you look at the archaeology here at Ribemont, they seem to be about right. We've got our piles of rotting cadavers, our decapitations, our horrible injuries caused by swords and spears. It looks like wanton violence. But you know, I'm not so sure. I don't think things are ever as straightforward as that. And underneath this apparent barbarism, we're looking for something really rather more complex.
So is this more than a simple mass grave of defeated warriors? Could this large arrangement of corpses and valuable weaponry have a higher purpose? Martin has returned to the burial site with archaeologist Dr. Simon James in order to find out more about the people who created it. What can the location of the site itself tell us?
Standing here, not only can we see a large block of valley and other hills, but also clearly this site was visible from all of those places too. So many hundreds of people regularly would be able to see this monument dominating the skyline. If we put that together also with the evidence we have from the site for how long it lasted, because it goes on from the 200s BC far into the Roman period, lasts for a period of what, 400 or 500 years, and clearly this was somewhere that was tremendously important to a large community over a long period of time.
Who exactly were these people who created this site?
Well, the site of Ribemont here is today in northern France, but in antiquity, the peoples who lived across this whole swathe of Europe, from Spain right the way out through France and across southern Germany, were known, at least to their neighbours, as Celts.
In which war did these hundreds of warriors meet their death?
Around about the 3rd century BC, warfare in areas like this would probably have existed on a number of scales, from the very small scale, from the personal, from the vendetta between perhaps aristocratic families who'd fallen foul of each other, up to intertribal conflicts with battles consisting of a few thousand warriors on each side.
The massive number of bones, along with our historical knowledge of the Celts, indicates that the dead most likely were warriors involved in a huge intertribal battle.
I think a battle at this period would have been over in no more than a few hours. You would have had the two armies turn up to face each other. According to later descriptions, they would often taunt each other and try to test each other's strength and resolve to battle. They would then charge into contact with each other, and a lot of the fighting was very close order, hand-to-hand fighting. And they would have been hacking away at each other with spears and with swords, and also using their shields as offensive weapons as well. One could imagine that quite frequently these battles would have resulted in large-scale carnage with hundreds of casualties.
The large-scale carnage supports the view of the classical writers who depicted the Celts as savage, war-hungry barbarians. Historian Diodorus Siculus gives an account of the Celts' practice of the severing of heads.
They decapitate their fallen enemies and attach their heads to their horses' necks. They preserve the heads of their most illustrious enemies in cedar oil and keep them carefully in a chest and show them off to guests.
Martin meets Simon on the battle site to find out more about the most striking feature of the burial, the decapitations.
Well, I think there are a number of possibilities. It's unlikely I'd have thought they just discarded them. I think the most likely explanation would tie together with the descriptions we have from classical writers who talk about headhunters, individual warriors taking the skulls of individual vanquished foes, and they would actually take them home and keep them actually as souvenirs and as physical expressions of their own individual bravery in battle.
So why the head?
Well, I think there are two main reasons. One is fairly obviously that this is the most recognisable part of us, and if you have beaten a particular famous warrior, what greater and more irrefutable evidence could you possibly have than actually taking their head home? I think the other angle on this is that the Celts seem to have believed that the head was the site of the soul. So by taking somebody's head, you didn't only take away their life, you also seized control of their spirit.
There might have been a religious or ritual purpose behind the mass decapitations. So is it fair to call this behavior savage, as the Roman and Greek historians did? Scholars argued whether or not this might just be negative propaganda. After all, can you trust a description of an ancient people which has been written by their enemies? And yet here is proof which appears to confirm the reports. So were they barbarians?
What we have here apparently is a great monument of human savagery. And it would be easy to dismiss these people as simply horrendous barbarians, but I think that would be a major misreading. It's clearly something that's been put together by a sophisticated society, a group of people who have come together in mass action. They've established an army, they fought a battle and they've won. So you have here a pretty rich and complex society in a populous landscape which was farming very effectively. And it did occasionally commit what we would regard as horrendous acts. But of course, we would not like our own society to be judged by solely the results of its wars.
A distinctive feature of Riedmühl is that the dead warriors were not simply cast arbitrarily into a mass grave. Their bones were arranged in a deliberate pattern, which may indicate it was part of a ritual or religious activity. Martin is keen to find other evidence that this was a religious sanctuary. One particular concentration of over 20,000 bones appears to have been formally arranged into some form of three-dimensional structure. The iron weapons amongst the bones indicate that they may also have formed part of the structure. This and the location of the site leads Martin to only one conclusion.
Well, it strikes me that we're not just looking at a scene of barbarism and big piles of bodies left after a battle. From what I've seen on site and talking to people, there's something else going on. It's right on the top of the hill. It dominates the landscape. You've got these arrangements of bones. You've got the weapons in amongst them. Whatever's going on here, we're looking at something structural, something built, something which is designed to last and make a big statement that can be seen from miles and miles around.
It appears that not only were the heads possibly removed as battle trophies, but a large display incorporating headless corpses and weapons was constructed most likely as a means of commemorating a great battle. Martin discusses this theory with Jean-Louis Bruneau, the leader of the excavations at Remont.
After a battle, there was a problem of what to do with the bodies of both the defeated and the victors. The Gauls would systematically decapitate the enemy immediately after they died and then keep the head for themselves. But the body, the weapons and all the enemy's worldly goods would be returned to the gods.
This offering of defeated headless warriors was displayed in a large wood-built quadrangle. When the wood decayed, the bones and weapons collapsed. In another enclosure, Bruneau and his team discovered a second intriguing arrangement of bones.
They were all aligned to one another, and there were only the bones of limbs, arms and legs. They formed a square, so during the course of the excavation, I realized that it was actually a low wall built in the shape of a cube, built entirely of bones.
This structure could have functioned as a kind of temple altar, a place where blessings and offerings would have been made to the gods. It is assumed that the thick walls consisted of the bones of the slain enemy, but a new theory is coming to light which challenges this. The bodies of the victors as well as the vanquished would have had to have been dealt with. But how?
Et c'est probablement le rôle de cet enclos que l'on a découvert.
Another probable role of the enclosures was that of honoring the deaths on the victor's side, by giving them a sort of funeral rite with a sacrifice.
Accompagné de sacrifices.
And just behind us, you can see a deep ditch with a room which would have been where the altar was. And it would have been on this altar that they would have slaughtered several dozen bovine animals, sheep or pigs and so on, in honor of their heroes' deaths.
These latest human bone discoveries by Bruneau and his team are accompanied by animal bones, some of which bear the marks of having been burnt. What does Martin make of the new evidence?
The latest evidence is that there are now 2 lots of bones, and some of them have got offerings amongst them. So are we looking at the winners and the defeated? But neither have got any heads. So this head removal is not just some sort of macho statement. It's about taking away something special, honouring it. This is deliberate ritual activity for some specific purpose, honouring noble warriors. Perhaps not only of your own side, but recognising some qualities that you admired and wanted to adopt in the people that you just defeated as well.
Whatever the exact nature of the bone temple at Remont, it is clear that all the heads, whether fallen heroes or enemies, were taken away, either to be honoured or simply hung as trophies. But for Martin, there is still an unsolved mystery.
Well, the one thing we don't know is where the heads have gone. There are a couple of theories. One is, if you look at this period in European prehistory, there's quite a lot of tradition of deposition in water. Objects, sacrifices, bone of various human and animal types being placed into marshes and rivers. Now, just literally down the slope from the site, there is the river Ancre. Is it possible that at least some of those heads were placed into that water as offerings to the gods who'd either given the victory or who were going to watch over the site for eternity?
Less than a mile away is another memorial to the war dead, those who fell at the Battle of the Somme during the First World War, a war in which Martin's own grandfather took part.
Even after all this research, there are still things about the site at Ribemont-sur-Ancre that I find very strange and alien. And yet, it's a site that deals with the commemoration of warfare. Here we are, literally walking distance down the hill from that Celtic site in a British military cemetery from the Great War of 1914 to 18. This site is also about commemoration and about warfare and about traumatic events. These sites are perhaps 2 sides of the same coin. That was their way of commemorating their dead, and this is ours.
South Africa, a beautiful land full of ancient mysteries. The tiny skull of an ape-like animal is discovered that may prove to be the long sought-after missing link. Can the fragile remains of this creature, known as the Tuang Child, reveal the truth of who we are and where we came from? And can science solve the mystery of this child's death?
The features that it contained were both ape-like and human-like at the same time. And this led to the description of the fossil as an ape man or a missing link.
It seems very likely that trauma was the killing agent and that that trauma was inflicted by predators.
The Tuang Child would have been vulnerable to leopard predation and the predation of saber-toothed cats.
Dr. Kevin Kuykendall is on a mission to find out exactly how this creature died and what its remains can tell us about human evolution. South Africa is a land of contrasts. Cities bustling with life, shops, marketplaces, and businesses. Yet far away from modern human life are vast sweeping savanna lands where the big game stalks. Cheetah, lion, hyena, leopard. And above them birds of prey, all hunting and scavenging for food on the veldt, once the dwelling place of great tribal warriors. This is a place with a long history, and amongst these dusty plains are hidden clues which could unlock the secrets of mankind's earliest beginnings. Millions of years ago, climate changes reduced the great forests, and the sweeping plains of Africa that we know today were created. At this time, the first footsteps were taken by our earliest ancestors. One of them was the Tuang Child, a youngster whose premature and violent death is shrouded in mystery. Dr. Kevin Kuykendall, an anatomist from Arizona, has been based in South Africa for 9 years, studying fossil remains of ancient primates. He wants to learn more about the life of the so-called Tuang Child and examine the evidence that may reveal details of the Tuang Child's death.
The Tuang Child fossil preserves many features that give us clues to the way in which it lived. But one of the mysteries that remains is the nature of its death. And so the question I want to investigate is, how did the Tuang Child die?
The fossil remains of the Tuang Child consist of these 3 fragile pieces: the front half of the cranium, the lower jaw complete with teeth, and an endocranial cast, a stony brain-shaped cast of the inside of the skull. These had lain undisturbed for millions of years, encased in limestone, before being uncovered at a quarry in the northwest province at Tong in 1924. Miners blasting for lime unearthed an interesting fossil. It was the endocranial cast. It was brought to the attention of Raymond Dart, a skilled anatomist working at the University of the Witwatersrand. Dart was intrigued by the shape of the brain that seemed bigger than a chimpanzee, but not as big as that of primitive man. The fossil skull was brought to him, encased in breccia, a hard mixture of sand, rocks, and lime cemented together. Using his wife's knitting needles, Dart began the painstaking job of freeing the fossils from the surrounding rock. When he finally laid eyes on this tiny face, Dart knew immediately that he had something special in his hands, something that would rewrite the history of human evolution.
The Tuang Child was a truly remarkable fossil discovery. Even though the fossil consisted of just a few fragments of the cranium and the mandible, the features that it contained were both ape-like and human-like at the same time. And this led to the description of the fossil as an ape man or a missing link.
In 1924, paleontologists were only just starting out on the path to understanding man's prehistoric origins. No remains of an ancient hominid, a word meaning belonging to the family of man, had ever been found in Africa. The discovery was reported with great excitement in South Africa. But what did the rest of the scientific establishment around the world make of it? Raymond Dart's successor at the University of the Witwatersrand, Professor Philip Tobias, explains.
It caused a worldwide stir, most of it unbelieving, incredulous, most of it scornful, critical of Dart. They derided him. He was talking nonsense. It's just a somewhat offbeat, beat-up chimpanzee.
Undeterred, Raymond Dart named this new species Australopithecus africanus, southern ape of Africa. It is today considered to be a likely forerunner of later forms of mankind, which in turn evolved into Homo sapiens, or modern man. The presence of a full set of baby teeth led Dart to conclude that it was a juvenile. Discovering the nature of its premature death, whether through accident, disease, or predator attack, could help us paint a picture of life on the African plains of one of our earliest ancestors. Much of the most important study of human evolution has been done 20 miles away from Tuang in Johannesburg, South Africa's commercial and financial center. It is carried out here at the University of the Witwatersrand, where Kevin is now based. Using the latest scientific techniques, he hopes to get a clearer picture of who this child was and exactly how he died. As guardian of the priceless Tuang specimen, Professor Tobias has invited Kevin to study at close quarters the original Tuang fossil, which is rarely removed from the department's safe.
This specimen is pretty much the one that started paleoanthropology, particularly in South Africa and really around the world. I remember the very first time I looked at it, it was as if I was looking at the crown jewels or something of that nature. It also happens to be one of the most beautiful specimens that exists anywhere. So it's just fascinating anytime to get a chance to look at the original.
Exactly how human was this creature? Its skull gives us several clues as to the extent of the ape-like and human-like features. It clearly illustrates the conundrum facing Raymond Dart upon its discovery.
What Dart found was human-like features and ape-like features, a most astonishing mixture, the likes of which no one had ever come across before. And this is the brain cast, and it is small. And the question was, is it small because it belongs to a child, or is it small because it belonged to a small-brained species? And the answer is it's a bit of both. And this was Dart's big problem. When we compare it with the ape brain, it's comparable in size with the brain size of a chimpanzee of corresponding dental age. And so this was a decidedly ape-like feature.
So why was Dart so convinced that his specimen was in fact more human-like than ape-like?
On the human side, the canine tooth was tiny. It's a milk canine, quite different from the milk canine of a chimpanzee. You see the remarkable difference. Even in the deciduous teeth, it's a fang. And so that was a very human-like feature that Dart drew attention to initially. All the canines of the upper teeth and of the lower teeth were tiny.
So the Tuang Child was human-like in the pattern of the teeth. But there was another feature that also appeared distinctly human-like.
On the base of the brain cast, Dart saw features, let's have a look, pointing to that skull having been articulated on a nearly upright vertebral column and not one hanging downwards and forwards as in a chimp or gorilla. The critically important factor he inferred from the base was that it was a biped going on 2 legs and not on 4 legs. And that's the mark of humanity.
So despite having a brain no bigger than an adult gorilla, the Tuang Child was no ordinary ape. It had a human-like jaw and had walked upright on two legs. In evolutionary terms, it had crossed, or was in the process of crossing, that great divide between ape and man, which is why it was dubbed the missing link. After detailed inspection of the dental development, Dart concluded that the Tuang Child was a young male of about 6 years old. However, subsequent analysis has refined this estimate.
We've been able to arrive at a new approach to the dating, studying the microscopic anatomy of the enamel even. And that has shown us that the little child was 3 to 4 years of age when it died.
This ancestor certainly died young, and the cause of death remains in question. Can the sex of the youngster be identified?
It's a difficult problem. Dart always called it a boy, partly because the first molar is very large by modern human standards, but unless you have lots of others to establish a kind of statistical curve of distribution, you can't be sure. In fact, in geological terms...
So the youngster's sex remains a mystery, and so does the cause of its premature death. Was it accident, illness, or disease that killed the Tuang Child? Kevin's search for answers takes him half an hour's drive away to South Africa's political and administrative capital, Pretoria. He's here to visit the Transvaal Museum of Anthropology and Geology, which houses a vast collection of natural history exhibits. He's been invited here by principal researcher Dr. Francis Thackeray to study the hominid fossils discovered at other archaeological sites.
From Stokefontein, we have a relatively large sample of Australopithecus africanus now. And we've been able to establish that these were omnivores. They were eating both plant food and they had access to animal protein.
The careful study of these other hominid remains has meant we now have a clearer picture of how the Tuang Child and his fellow Australopithecines would have lived.
If one imagines what might have happened in the day of an Australopithecine 2.5 million years ago, one can imagine them getting up in the morning as temperature rises at sunrise, and they may well have scavenged the carcasses of wildebeest and hartebeest. They might also have been digging for termites. We know that the bone tools were used for opening up termite mounds. They may well have also hunted. Obviously, small prey may have been accessible, but very likely scavenging was an important mode of getting access to protein.
The life and times of the Tuang Child are becoming clearer, but can these other fossil remains, many of which also appear to have suffered premature, sometimes violent deaths, give us any clues as to how the Tuang Child died?
From Swartkrans, we have this specimen. It's called Australopithecus robustus, and you can see very clearly there are 2 puncture marks there, and the distance between holes matches very closely the distance between the tips of the canines of a leopard. So this is strong evidence of what happened on one day, approximately 1.5 million years ago, and it's entirely possible that the Tuang Child was also susceptible to carnivore predation.
So perhaps the young 3 or 4 year old Tuang Child didn't die of illness or disease. Perhaps, like many of its relations, it suffered a horrible death at the jaws of a big cat. Kevin wants to discover the extent to which hominids were routinely hunted and killed by predators, and whether this could have been the fate of the Tuang Child. For this, he needs to study other examples of this species. About 250 miles from Tuang are the Sterkfontein Caves, a World Heritage Site, where visitors can experience the anthropological treasure house of the world and imagine their earliest upright walking ancestors roaming and hunting across this landscape. Here, many more Australopithecus africanus remains, the same species as Tuang Child, were discovered in the years following Dart's studies. By examining these, Kevin can get a clearer picture of the life and death of the Tuang Child. Kevin explores the site with Professor Tim Partridge of the Sterkfontein Research Unit to find out why these caves have provided us with so many hominid remains.
The circumstances of preservation here are very special. These are dolomite caves, rich in calcium carbonate, and as the fossil material finds its way into the caves, together with soil and other debris, they are replaced molecule by calcium carbonate, which is a very hard material. So that helps the preservation process.
And how is it that those particular specimens actually got into the cave fill?
Some of them were dropped in the vicinity of the mouths of the caves by predators and scavengers and found their way into the entrances. Others fell in through deep shafts, cave in that case acting as a death trap.
So did the Tuang Child fall to his death through the roof of the cave? If so, it seems that the whole skeleton would have been found, and not just the head. The fact that the body was missing, coupled with the remains of other mammalian prey at the site, suggests that it was the lair of a predator, complete with the scattered remains of its prey. So what kind of predator could this have been? On the plains, not far away from the caves, Tim Partridge paints a picture of the harsh life that our early ancestors would have endured.
It would have been a fairly hostile world. There would have been the usual range of predators that one has on the African veldt. And it is thought commonly that leopards were among the most dangerous of the predators for these early hominids. But other evidence also suggests that eagles and one or two other creatures, such as the long-legged hunting hyena, might well have been implicated as well.
It now seems almost certain that one of these predators dragged the child into the cave at Tuang, where its skull was discovered amongst the scattered fossil remains of baboon and antelope. And is there any evidence amongst the dozens of hominid remains found over the years at the Sterkfontein caves that can help us date the Tuang Child more exactly and find out whether it really was the missing link? The fruitful decades of the mid-20th century yielded dozens of hominid remains, which were clearly related to the Tuang Child, though identified at first as belonging to a different genus, Plesianthropus, meaning almost human. The most famous was given the nickname Mrs. Pless, a beautifully preserved skull believed to be that of an adult female. Later, Mrs. Pless and the other Sterkfontein remains were reclassified as Australopithecus africanus. Mrs. Pless is now kept at the Transvaal Museum in Pretoria. Dr. Francis Thackeray tells the story of its discovery in 1947 by paleontologist Dr. Robert Broom.
Robert Broom had gone in illegally, actually, and he had the assistance of miners. Remarkably, Sterkfontein, just as at Tuang, miners were blasting for limestone. And Robert Broom asked the miners, blast here. And when the dust had settled, there was Mrs. Pless in two pieces. The top of the cranium had actually been blasted out.
The accurate dating of Mrs. Pless is key to identifying her and the Tuang Child as part of the missing link.
Mrs. Pless has been found with fossils of many species, pigs, antelope, and these can be used actually for dating by comparison with the East African sites, which are well dated using potassium and argon.
Further research into the magnetic properties of the calcite at Sterkfontein and Tuang has revealed the comparative dates of the fossils found there. Scientists now know just how long ago Mrs. Pless and the Tuang Child lived.
We believe that Mrs. Pless is in the order of 2.6 million years. And we believe that the Tuang Child is likely to be somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million years.
These findings corroborate Dart's claim that indeed he had identified the missing link in the Tuang Child. Returning to Johannesburg, Kevin still has a lot of unanswered questions on his mind.
Well, now I'm going to head back to the university to have another look at the fossils in the safe. We've established pretty clearly that the Tuang Child died due to some predator, and now we want to know which one.
Kevin takes the precious Tuang Child fossil from its home in the university safe to the Mill Park Hospital in the center of Johannesburg. Here, the different pieces of the fossil are scanned using the latest CT technology. Kevin is looking for any evidence of predator attack. The skeletal fossils show no such signs. However, the fossilized endocranial cast, representing the shape of the empty brain cavity, reveals some interesting indentations on the top and to one side. These will be examined by CAT scan.
Well, the advantage of using a technology like CT is it allows us to essentially dissect the specimen without causing any damage to it. And that's really the critical aspect for analyzing fossils, because we don't want to damage them.
The CAT scan allowed the scientists to visualize the internal structures and to create 3D reconstructions of the Tuang Child's face, jaw, and endocranial cast, but didn't enlighten them further on the cause of death. Kevin seeks the opinion once again of Professor Philip Tobias. He provides a dramatic hypothesis to explain these small depressions.
Just lift that a little. Yeah. Between the four depressions, we've got the possible marks of a four-taloned eagle claw. The right distance apart and right relative sizes of the three anterior ones and this large posterior one, the killing talon. And so there is evidence there which seems to support the theory put forward by Berger and Clark that an aerial predator, not a terrestrial predator, namely a raptor like a big black eagle, could have carried it off, shook its head off from the rest of the body, and been responsible for getting the head of the Tuang Child into that area.
This is by no means a far-fetched idea. There have been modern-day reports of eagles attempting to carry off small children. In August 2001, on a crowded beach in New England, an eagle swooped down, grabbed a child's head in its claws, and attempted to carry it off.
So that kind of behavior is with us today on the part of raptors. Could it have had a 2.5 million year history, that sort of behavior, of which this is a spectacular and tragic example.
So finally, have we discovered the fate of the Tuang Child? Perhaps as he foraged on the open plain, he was attacked and borne aloft by a huge primate-eating eagle, his body shaken free and his head carried off to a cave. Kevin is left to contemplate this horrific possibility.
I'm still a bit skeptical. The marks on the brain cast could perhaps have been formed by other factors. Perhaps something relating to the blasting that uncovered the skull in the first place, or some other preservational factor that resulted in the brain cast itself. So perhaps this answer will remain a mystery.
So for Kevin, the exact nature of the child's death remains inconclusive. However, he is certain of one thing. Today, millions of years after the small hominid child met his end, its amazing fossil continues to play a crucial role in our understanding of human evolution.